This isn't something I pulled from Reddit or some anonymous forum. When she told me this story, her hands were shaking, and that was almost 2 years after it happened. So believe what you want, and it still keeps me up at night. This girl, I'm going to call her Maren, she's always been into exploring. Abandoned places, forgotten structures, things that most people don't even know exist. She'd spend hours on forums and old websites, digging up coordinates for decommissioned buildings deep in national forests, places that had been left to rot for decades. She had this thing about fire lookout towers specifically. There are hundreds of them scattered across forests all over the country, most of them abandoned since the 60s or 70s, when planes and satellites took over the job. Some have been restored, turned into rentals or maintained by volunteer groups. But most of them are just out there, sitting empty on ridgelines and mountaintops, slowly falling apart. Maren had visited a few of the easier ones before, the kind you can reach on a maintained trail, with maybe a 2 or 3 hour hike. But she'd found one online that was different. It was deep in a forest, about 4 hours' drive from where she lived, way off any marked trail, in a section of wilderness that barely had any human traffic at all. She'd found a few posts about it on an old hiking forum, people who'd made the trek out there and camped in it overnight. They said the structure was still standing, still mostly intact, and the views from the top were unreal. But the newest post she could find was from 3 years earlier, so there was no guarantee it was still there, or still safe. For all she knew, the whole thing could have collapsed by now. She also knew it was technically illegal. The lookout wasn't maintained by anyone. It had been officially decommissioned decades ago, and the Forest Service had put up warnings that it was structurally unsafe and that entering it was at your own risk. But that had never stopped people before, and it wasn't going to stop Maren. She planned the trip for late autumn, when the forest would be quietest, and she'd have the best chance of being completely alone up there. I remember her telling me about the planning phase like it was the most exciting thing she'd ever done. She had topographic maps spread out on her kitchen table, a handheld satellite GPS she'd borrowed from a friend, and 2 days' worth of gear packed into the lightest backpack she could manage. She'd mapped out the route from the nearest road to the lookout, roughly 4 to 5 hours of cross-country hiking through dense forest, with no trail whatsoever. Just her, the GPS, and whatever the woods decided to throw at her. She drove out on a Friday morning, alone. The drive took her through smaller and smaller towns, until eventually there were no towns at all. Just long, empty stretches of 2-lane road, cutting through endless forest. She found the spot she'd identified on satellite images, a shallow ditch on the side of a logging road where she could tuck her car mostly out of sight. She pulled in, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute. The forest was enormous. It pressed right up against the road on both sides, dense and dark even in the middle of the day. The trees here were old, not ancient, but old enough to have grown tall and thick, their canopies merging overhead into a ceiling that filtered the daylight into something gray and muted. There was no sound except the ticking of the cooling engine and a faint rustling high above, where the branches moved in a wind she couldn't feel on the ground. She told me she almost didn't get out of the car, that there was this moment, sitting there in the driver's seat with the door still closed, where everything in her said wait. Not don't go, just wait. Like her body was asking for one more second to reconsider. But she'd driven 4 hours and planned this for weeks. She wasn't going to sit in a ditch and drive home. She grabbed her pack, checked her GPS, and started walking. The first hour was fine. The terrain was manageable, mostly flat ground with scattered undergrowth, and enough space between the trees to move without too much trouble. She could still hear the occasional car on the logging road behind her, a faint hum that reminded her civilization existed. The forest here was almost pleasant. Shafts of pale sunlight breaking through the canopy, the crunch of pine needles underfoot. the occasional bird call high above. It felt like any other hike. Challenging, but normal. Safe. But by the second hour, everything changed. The sound of the road was gone. Completely gone. The last thread connecting her to the world she knew had been cut, silently, without her noticing exactly when it happened. And the forest had changed around her in ways that felt deliberate. The trees were closer together now, thicker, their trunks dark with moisture and wrapped in moss that climbed halfway up before giving way to bare, grey bark. The undergrowth had thickened too, ferns as tall as her waist, fallen logs covered in shelf fungus, patches of ground so soft with decomposing needles that her boots sank an inch with every step. And the canopy overhead had closed almost completely, turning the forest floor into a permanent twilight. Even though it was barely past noon, she needed a moment to let her eyes adjust every time she stopped to check her GPS. The silence was the thing that got to her first. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that has texture, that you can feel settling on your shoulders like a physical weight. No birds, no insects, no wind at ground level. Just the sound of her own breathing and the soft crush of her footsteps, which felt obscenely loud in the stillness, like she was announcing herself to something that preferred not to be heard. Maren told me she started talking to herself around the third hour. Not out of loneliness, but because the silence was becoming oppressive. She'd narrate what she was doing. Okay, going around this log, heading northeast. Should be about 2 more hours. Just to fill the space with something human. She said it helped for a while, but then she realized that every time she stopped talking, the silence rushed back in faster than before, like water filling a hole. And each time it came back, it felt heavier, more expectant, like something had been listening to her voice and was now waiting for her to continue. She shook it off. She kept walking. The terrain got steeper as she climbed toward the ridge where the lookout was supposed to be. The trees thinned slightly at elevation, letting in a little more light, and the undergrowth gave way to rocky ground and exposed roots. She was breathing hard, her legs burning from the climb, when she caught the first glimpse of it through the trees. The fire lookout, still standing. It rose above the tree line like a skeleton, a square wooden cabin perched on top of 4 tall metal support legs, maybe 12 or 15 meters off the ground. The wood was grey and weathered, stripped of whatever paint it had once worn. The windows that wrapped around all 4 sides were cloudy and cracked, but mostly intact. A metal ladder ran up one of the support legs to a small hatch in the floor of the cabin. It looked like something from another era, which it was. Something forgotten by everyone except the forest, which was slowly, patiently taking it back. Maren stood at the base and looked up for a long time. The structure was listing slightly to one side, and the wooden railing around the observation deck was missing sections. But the metal legs looked solid. She walked to each one and pushed against it with her full weight. They didn't budge. The concrete footings were cracked, but still anchored deep in the ground. It wasn't perfect, but it was standing, and it had been standing for decades. She decided it would hold her for one night. She tested the ladder. Metal rungs, cold under her hands, bolted to the support leg. Each step produced a high-pitched creak that echoed off the trees and made the whole structure vibrate faintly. She climbed slowly, testing each rung before committing her weight, her backpack pulling her backward with every reach upward. Halfway up, she made the mistake of looking down. The ground was already far enough below to make her stomach lurch. The trees at eye level seemed to lean in toward her, their branches reaching like fingers. She looked back up and kept climbing. When she pulled herself through the hatch and onto the floor of the cabin, she forgot everything for a moment. The fear, the exhaustion, the isolation, all of it vanished. Because the view was staggering. In every direction, the forest stretched to the horizon. An ocean of green and gray, rolling over hills and filling valleys, unbroken by any road or building or clearing. No cell towers, no power lines, no sign of human existence anywhere. Just wilderness, vast and indifferent, fading into a haze at the edges of the sky. She could see weather moving, a dark bank of clouds approaching from the west, slow and heavy, trailing curtains of mist beneath them. The wind was stronger up here, steady and cold, pulling at her hair and pressing against her jacket. She told me that standing up there, she felt two things at once, and they were completely contradictory. The first was awe. Pure, genuine awe at the scale of the world and the beauty of standing above it alone. And the second was a deep, primal smallness, a feeling that she was a single organism standing on a metal pole above an endless forest that could swallow her whole and never even notice. Both feelings were real, both were overwhelming, and for a few minutes they existed in perfect balance. Then she went inside. The cabin was small, maybe 15 square meters at most. One room. A decaying metal frame bed sat in one corner, its mattress long gone, replaced by a layer of dust and dead leaves that had blown in through the cracked windows. An old wooden desk occupied the opposite corner, its surface warped and stained. The windows ran the full length of every wall, floor to nearly ceiling, which once would have given whoever worked here a complete panoramic view for spotting fires. Now they just let in the grey light and the wind, which whistled softly through the gaps where the glazing had separated from the frames. She set down her pack, rolled out her sleeping pad and bag on the cleanest section of floor she could find, set up her small camping stove and heated a meal. Ate, sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching the clouds build through the western windows. It was peaceful. Genuinely peaceful. She told me she felt, for the first time in months, like she could breathe. Like all the noise and pressure and expectations of her normal life were somewhere far below her, buried under 5 hours of forest. And up here, there was nothing but sky and silence, and the slow creak of old wood adjusting to the wind. The sunset was extraordinary. She went out onto the observation deck and sat with her legs hanging over the edge, watching the sun drop into the clouds on the horizon. The light turned gold, then amber, then a deep, burning red that lit up the underside of the approaching cloud bank like fire. The forest below went from green to black in stages, the shadows climbing the hills like rising water, until the only light left was a thin orange line at the edge of the world. And then that was gone too, and there was nothing but darkness. She stayed out on the deck after the sun went down. There was nowhere to be, nothing to do, and the night air, while cold, felt clean and sharp in a way that made her want to stay awake. The clouds had moved in fully now, blocking whatever moon or stars might have been overhead. The darkness was total. She couldn't see the trees below her, couldn't see the ground. The lookout felt like it was floating in a void, suspended in nothing, and the only evidence of the forest was the soft rush of wind through the canopy far below, a sound like breathing. She'd been sitting there for maybe an hour, wrapped in her jacket with her knees pulled up, when she saw it. A light, moving through the trees below. Not a flashlight, not a headlamp. It was warmer than that, more orange, and it flickered, like a flame, like someone carrying a torch through the woods in the middle of the night. Maren leaned forward, gripping the edge of the deck, and watched. The light moved slowly, weaving between the tree trunks, maybe 100 meters from the base of the lookout. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, but it was close enough that she could see the faint glow reflecting off the nearest trees, painting their bark in shifting orange. It moved with purpose, not wandering randomly, but traveling in a direction, like someone who knew where they were going. Her first thought was another explorer, someone else who'd found the lookout online and made the hike out. But the odds of that were almost zero. This place was hours from any road, with no trail, in a section of forest that saw almost no human traffic. She hadn't seen another car on the logging road. She hadn't seen footprints or trail markers or any sign of another person during her entire 5-hour hike in. And even if someone else was out here, who hikes through dense forest at night with a torch? Not a flashlight, not a headlamp, but an actual open flame. She watched the light for several minutes. It continued moving through the trees in a slow, steady arc, never speeding up, never stopping. And then it passed behind something, a dense cluster of trees maybe, or a rise in the terrain, and she lost sight of it. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. It didn't reappear. Maren sat on the deck for another half hour after the light vanished, scanning the darkness in every direction, looking for any sign of it. Nothing. The forest was black and silent. Eventually, the cold started to get to her, and she told herself to let it go. Someone was camping out there. It was weird, but not threatening. They hadn't come near the lookout. They hadn't shown any interest in her. Maybe it was a hunter, or some local who knew these woods and had their own reasons for being out here at night. It was strange, but it didn't have to be dangerous. She stood up to take one last look before going inside, stretched her legs, put her hands on the railing, and looked straight down. Someone was standing at the base of the lookout, right there. Directly below her, in the small grassy clearing between the tower's support legs and the tree line. A dark figure, standing perfectly still, face tilted upward, looking at her. Every muscle in her body locked. Her hands gripped the railing so hard the rusted metal bit into her palms. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare down at this person who was staring up at her from 12 meters below in the pitch dark, in the middle of nowhere. She called out, said hello. Her voice sounded wrong up there, too loud, too thin, swallowed immediately by the wind and the dark. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't make any sound at all. They just stood there, a dark shape against darker ground, face up, looking at her. The silence between them stretched out, 10 seconds, 15, and it was the longest silence of her life. It wasn't the silence of someone who hadn't heard her. It was the silence of someone who had heard her and was choosing not to answer. Then, slowly, the figure raised one hand. Not a wave, just a hand, lifted to about shoulder height, palm facing her. It could have been a greeting. It could have been an apology. It could have been something else entirely. The gesture lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the hand came down. The figure turned, slowly, and walked into the tree line. No flashlight, no torch, no light of any kind. They just walked into the wall of darkness between the trees and were gone. Swallowed whole, the way the forest had been swallowing everything all day. Sound, light, sense of direction, sense of safety. One moment the figure was there, a solid shape against the dark. The next moment, nothing, as if the trees had simply closed around them like a curtain. Maren stood on the deck for a long time after that. She told me her whole body was vibrating, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something chemical. Adrenaline. Her mind was racing, trying to process what she'd just seen. trying to force it into a category that made sense. Another hiker, a local, someone curious about the lookout who saw it was occupied and decided to leave. That was the rational explanation. That was the one she chose to believe, because the alternative, that someone had been watching her from the darkness, had walked to the base of the tower where she was sleeping, and had stood there looking up at her in silence, was not something she could sit with alone at the top of a tower in the middle of the night. She went inside, zipped up her sleeping bag, tried to sleep. It wasn't easy. The wind had picked up and the cabin moved with it, not dramatically, but enough to notice. A subtle swaying, accompanied by deep groans from the wooden beams and the constant rattle of wind against the cracked windows. Every few minutes, something would creak louder than usual, and her eyes would snap open, staring at the dark ceiling, heart pounding, waiting for the next sound. But sleep did come, eventually. She doesn't know how long she was out. Could have been an hour, could have been 3. What she does know is that when she woke up, it was still completely dark, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing. The cabin was quiet, eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like the world has been muted on purpose. She opened her eyes and lay there, wondering what had woken her. And then she heard it. A soft, metallic creak. From outside. From below. The ladder. She sat up, held her breath, listened. For a moment, nothing. Then another creak. And another. Slow, rhythmic, spaced a few seconds apart. The unmistakable sound of someone placing their weight on a metal rung, one step at a time, climbing up. The sound carried through the entire structure. She could feel it as much as hear it, each step sending a faint vibration through the metal legs, up through the floor, into her body. The tower was resonating with someone's weight. Someone was climbing up to her. Maren's hands were shaking so badly she could barely unzip her sleeping bag. She got to her feet, grabbed her backpack. She told me she has no idea why she grabbed it. Just instinct. The same instinct that had been trying to talk to her all day, and moved as quietly as she could toward the hatch that opened onto the observation deck. The creaking was getting louder and faster. Whoever was on the ladder had started climbing more quickly, the metallic groans coming closer together, each one slightly higher in pitch as they got nearer to the top. She could feel the urgency in the rhythm. They knew she was awake. They were hurrying. She pushed through the hatch onto the deck. The cold air hit her like a wall. The deck was narrow, maybe a meter wide, running around all 4 sides of the cabin. She couldn't see anything beyond the railing, just solid darkness in every direction. But she could hear the ladder. The creaking had stopped. She stood still, trying to control her breathing, trying to listen past the hammer of her own heartbeat. Nothing. Total silence. She waited 5 seconds. 10. Then, slowly, she moved along the deck toward the corner where the ladder was mounted. She peered around the corner. Nobody was there. The top of the ladder was empty. The hatch at the base of the deck, where the ladder met the platform, was open and dark. She crept closer, gripping the railing with one hand, her backpack clutched to her chest with the other. She leaned over and looked down the ladder. Empty. All the way down. Just metal rungs disappearing into the darkness below. No one climbing. No one standing at the bottom. No one anywhere. She stood there, trying to make her brain work, trying to understand how someone who had been climbing the ladder 30 seconds ago was now gone. She'd heard them. She'd felt them through the floor. The vibrations had been real. The sound had been real. You can't fake the resonance of weight on a metal structure. Someone had been on that ladder. And now they weren't. And that's when she heard it. behind her, on the opposite side of the deck. Footsteps. Fast. Running. The heavy thud of boots on the wooden walkway, coming around the cabin toward her. She didn't see much, just a shape, dark, fast, human-sized, moving between the windows on the far side as it rounded the corner. A flash of movement caught in the edge of her peripheral vision, close enough that she could hear the breathing, ragged and harsh. Maren didn't think. She swung her legs over the edge of the hatch and found the first rung of the ladder with her foot. She was shaking so violently that the metal was vibrating under her grip. She descended as fast as her body would allow, hand over hand, rung after rung, her backpack slamming against her spine with every step. Above her, she heard the footsteps reach the hatch. She heard hands on metal. She heard them start to follow. She looked up once, just once, and saw a head lean out over the edge, a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark sky, looking down at her. She couldn't see features, couldn't see a face, just a shape, watching her descend. She didn't stop. She made it to the ground, stumbled, caught herself, and ran. Into the trees, into the darkness. Away from the tower, away from whoever was up there, away from everything. She ran blindly for what felt like minutes, but was probably seconds, before she forced herself to stop and pull out her GPS. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to turn it on. But it came on, and the route back to her car was still saved. She hiked through the rest of the night. 5 hours through pitch-black forest with no trail, guided by the faint glow of a GPS screen, stumbling over roots and rocks and fallen logs, soaked in sweat and shivering from cold at the same time. Every sound was amplified by the silence around her. A branch falling somewhere in the distance sounded like a footstep. The creak of a tree trunk in the wind sounded like the groan of a metal ladder. Her own breathing was so loud in her ears that she kept holding it, just to listen, just to make sure the only person breathing out here was her. She kept her flashlight on because she had to, but every time the beams swept through the trees, she expected to see someone standing there. She expected to hear footsteps behind her. She expected a hand on her shoulder. None of that happened. The forest was empty, or at least it seemed empty. She never heard anyone following her, never saw the torchlight again, never heard another footstep that wasn't her own. But she told me that the entire hike out, all 5 hours of it, she never once felt alone. There was this presence, not something she could point to, not a sound or a shape, just a feeling. Like the darkness itself had weight and intention, and was walking beside her, matching her pace, watching her leave. She reached her car just as the first grey light was starting to bleed through the trees. The car was untouched. No one had been there. She threw her pack in the back, started the engine, and drove. She didn't stop driving until she was back in her town, parked in her own driveway, with her doors locked and the sun fully up. She never reported it. She told me she thought about it, but what would she say? Someone climbed a ladder in the dark and then ran at her. There was no crime to report, no injury, no evidence. She didn't get a look at the person's face. She didn't know if it was a man or a woman. She didn't know if it was the same person with the torch or someone else entirely. She didn't know anything. And that's the part that still haunts her. Because she's gone over it 1,000 times in her head, and none of the explanations work. If it was just another hiker, why not respond when she called out? Why stand in the dark beneath the tower, looking up and say nothing? Why raise a hand in that strange, ambiguous gesture, and then disappear without a light? And then, hours later, why climb the ladder to where she was sleeping? Why stop climbing when she woke up? And how did they get from the ladder to the other side of the deck without her seeing them move? She told me the thing that scares her most isn't what happened on the tower, It's what would have happened if she hadn't woken up. If the creaking of the ladder hadn't pulled her out of sleep. If she'd been a heavier sleeper or more tired, or if the wind had still been blowing and covered the sound. What would she have woken up to? Or would she have woken up at all? And the other thing, the thing she comes back to every time, is the backpack. She grabbed it without thinking, pure instinct. If she hadn't, she would have made it to the ground with no GPS, no flashlight, and no way to navigate 5 hours of trailless forest in total darkness. She would have been stranded at the base of that tower with whoever was up there, in the dark, alone. She told me once, very quietly, that she thinks about the lookout sometimes. Not with nostalgia, not with curiosity, with this cold, sick feeling in her stomach, because she knows it's still out there. Sitting on that ridge, above the trees, in a part of the forest that nobody visits. And she wonders if whoever was out there that night is still there too, waiting in the dark, listening for the creak of the ladder, watching for the next person, stupid enough or brave enough or unlucky enough to climb up. That fire lookout is still standing, I checked, and as far as I can tell, nobody has posted about visiting it since. The last entry on the forum is still from years ago. The coordinates are still there. The satellite images still show the tiny square of the cabin, perched above the tree line, alone on the ridge, surrounded by miles and miles of empty forest. It looks so small from above, so harmless, just a forgotten building in a forgotten place. But someone was up there that night. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who waited in the dark, climbed a ladder in silence, and then ran toward a girl who was sleeping alone 12 meters above the ground. And whoever that was, they're probably still out there. Because nobody went looking for them. Nobody ever will. So, yeah, that's the story. Be careful where you explore, everyone. And if you're ever alone in the dark, and you hear something climbing towards you, don't wait to find out what it is. Just go.